I sat at the edge of the armchair, fingers tracing the envelope that held the prenup. My heart caught somewhere between hope and unease. Today was meant to be a celebration of my son's love, a day where family gathered to honor new beginnings. Yet something in the air felt brittle, as if the room itself was bracing for tension. I could hear the faint hum of the street outside, children laughing, oblivious to the storm that might break inside our own walls. I placed the envelope carefully on the table, whispering to myself that all I wanted was fairness and respect. This is just the start of our story. Tell me, have you ever prepared for a family moment, only to realize the very people you trust might become the source of betrayal? The doorbell rang, and I felt a shiver I couldn't explain. She walked in with that precise smile, the one that suggested confidence and calculation all at once. My son followed nervously, glancing between us, caught in the middle of a storm he hadn't realized was brewing. I tried to steady my thoughts, to remind myself that this was supposed to be a joyful occasion. But then, in the split second before she even spoke, I saw it. The subtle narrowing of her eyes, the firmness in her jaw. Something was already off. "You brought it?" she asked, voice calm but sharp. And just like that, the fragile calm shattered. The envelope felt heavier in my hand, every word unspoken pressing down. This was the moment that would define the day, and perhaps the family itself. I remember standing just inside the living room, the envelope in my hand, feeling the weight of more than paper. It wasn't just a contract, it was a boundary, a safeguard against the possibility that love could be overshadowed by entitlement. I glanced at my son, hoping to see the reassurance I needed, but his fingers drummed nervously against the armrest, betraying his own uncertainty. I could tell he wanted to say something, some half-hearted justification or plea for calm, but the words never came. They never do they? When tension sits in a room, it often speaks louder than anyone ever could. She moved with precise confidence, crossing to the center of the room as if it were a stage, her eyes fixed on the envelope. I tried to imagine what she was thinking. Was it the legal phrasing, the idea of dividing what could never really be divided, or just the control she wanted to assert? I didn't know, and my attempts to guess felt childish and futile. The room's air shifted, thickening, as if it too was waiting for some verdict that I wasn't sure I could withstand. We all knew the rules she had set. Prenup or no wedding. Simple, final, absolute. Yet when I produced the envelope, carefully folded and clearly marked, her smile faltered for the briefest moment before returning with greater intensity. I could see it in her eyes, a mixture of disbelief and irritation, a silent argument forming before a word was even spoken. My son shuffled his weight from one foot to another, clearly caught between relief that the envelope existed and dread of what was about to unfold. "I brought it," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady, almost to convince myself as much as her. Her response was not immediate. She examined the envelope as if it were a puzzle too small to be interesting, too trivial to be significant. The silence stretched between us, the kind of silence that sharpens nerves and highlights every unspoken thought. My mind wandered for a moment, to the years of preparation, the advice I had sought from lawyers and friends, the careful attention to every clause that might one day prevent resentment. All of it seemed suddenly fragile, as if the ink on the paper could be torn away with a single glance. "You brought it, but I don't think it matters," she said, tilting her head slightly, her voice calm yet commanding. It wasn't rude, not exactly, but it carried an unmistakable finality. I felt the first stab of doubt, the creeping suspicion that the day we had all been anticipating might unravel before the vows were even exchanged. My son looked at her, a flash of frustration crossing his face, quickly masked by what I can only assume was restraint. I wanted to step forward, to intervene, but some unspoken force held me in place, reminding me that this was his moment too, even if the rules had been dictated by someone else. I tried to focus on what I had done, the effort it took to prepare something so carefully. Every clause, every term, every safeguard was meant to protect, not punish. And yet, here it was, met with the kind of dismissal that left a bitter taste in my mouth. I wondered if she had even read it, or if her mind was already constructing reasons to refuse, to assert dominance before any of us had a chance to speak. The room felt suddenly smaller, more intense, as if the walls themselves had been privy to my worries for decades and had chosen this moment to squeeze them to the surface. I saw my son shift uneasily, glancing toward me, silently pleading for patience or understanding. But the envelope remained the fulcrum of our tension, a quiet yet undeniable presence between the three of us. I thought of my own parents, how they had handled disputes with quiet dignity and careful words, never letting emotion dictate their actions, and I tried to emulate that same measured approach. Yet there was something about witnessing potential betrayal that makes even the most cautious heart tremble. She finally spoke, breaking the silence. "I don't think we need this at all." And just like that, the calm that I had clung to evaporated. It wasn't confrontation in the loud, angry sense. It was a quiet assertion of power, the kind that leaves you unsure whether to respond with words or simply endure. My son's jaw tightened, and I realized he was reading her gestures, her tone, the unspoken rules that she was imposing, far more clearly than I was. It was a subtle war, fought in the spaces between sentences, in the half-smiles and fleeting glances. In that moment, I realized that what we had thought was preparation might only be a prelude to disappointment. The envelope, once a symbol of fairness and order, had become a trigger, a test of patience, and perhaps a measure of how far one would go to bend others to their will. I could feel the tension ripple outward, touching the air, the furniture, even the shadows that pooled in the corners of the room. Everything seemed alive with anticipation, as if the room itself were holding its breath. My mind raced, weighing the potential outcomes. Could this be resolved with reason, with calm conversation? Or had we reached a point where intentions no longer mattered, where what I thought was protective became irrelevant? The thought of my son facing disappointment, confusion, and the subtle manipulation I sensed in her posture made my chest tighten. This was not just a confrontation about a piece of paper. It was a deeper test of character, of loyalty, and of the fragile bonds of trust within a family. I tried to keep my composure, reminding myself that actions mattered more than emotions. Yet every fiber of my being bristled with the knowledge that what happened next could alter relationships permanently. I could see my son glance at me, hoping for some signal, some indication that the day could proceed without fracture. But my own doubts reflected back at him, making the moment more precarious than either of us could have anticipated. She finally picked up the envelope, turning it in her hands as if it were a trivial weight, then set it back down without a word. My stomach tightened. The quiet dismissal was far worse than an outright refusal. It carried with it the implication that we were powerless to assert what we had prepared. I watched my son's eyes flicker, catching every subtle cue, his fingers tightening into fists at his sides. It was clear that he had been counting on this moment, but now he faced uncertainty, and with it, a sudden sense of vulnerability. I took a slow breath, aware that I could either react with confrontation or allow this fragile pause to stretch a little longer, giving us time to measure our steps. The room was silent once more, save for the faint hum of life outside our walls, and I realized that the first test had been set. And in that test, every intention, every act of care, and every expectation would be quietly measured. The silence hung heavier than I anticipated, stretching across the room like a fragile bridge about to snap. I could sense the invisible tension between my son and his fiancée, a subtle push and pull that neither of them fully acknowledged yet. My hands itched to smooth over the moment, to offer some reassurance. But I knew this was not my battle to fix. This was theirs, and they would navigate the consequences of pride, expectation, and control. I noticed the faint crease forming on my son's forehead, a telltale sign of his inner conflict. His fiancée, on the other hand, seemed unnervingly composed, almost like she was anticipating my presence, my preparation, my intent to protect my child from disappointment. Yet, in that calmness, there was also an undercurrent I couldn't ignore, a subtle assertion that she was holding the upper hand, at least for now. I reminded myself to breathe, to not let the room's pressure dictate my responses. But every breath felt measured, like I was counting seconds before the inevitable confrontation. The envelope lay on the table, more significant than any ring, any floral arrangement, any plan we had made for the wedding. I found myself studying its folds and creases, as if their alignment or placement could somehow influence the outcome. I thought back to the mornings spent reading legal terms, negotiating clauses, ensuring that fairness wasn't merely theoretical. All of that effort seemed almost ceremonial in the face of her quiet refusal to even glance at the pages inside. "You know, there's a part here you might not like," I said cautiously, trying to break the tension without escalating it. The words felt hollow the moment they left my mouth. Her gaze didn't waver, but her eyes flicked briefly toward my son, as if signaling some silent alliance, some prearranged understanding. I realized then that whatever she had planned, it wasn't just about the prenup. It was about control, influence, and framing the narrative of what was supposed to be a happy beginning. My son leaned forward slightly, the kind of subtle motion that conveys both anxiety and resolve. I could almost hear the thoughts running through his mind. The anticipation, the frustration, the fear that his own choices might disappoint or anger both of us. I felt a pang of sympathy and a surge of helplessness at the same time. I wanted to reassure him, but the weight of the room's unspoken rules reminded me that words could be misinterpreted, that any advice I offered might tip the scales in a direction I could neither foresee nor undo. I watched her finally pick up the envelope, turning it over in her hands with careful precision. The moment felt suspended, as if time itself had slowed to allow her every gesture to convey meaning. I wondered what she was thinking, how she was interpreting our intentions, and whether she understood the stakes for all of us. Was it pride that prevented her from opening it immediately, or a deeper mistrust, a fear that fairness might limit her own vision for the future? Every possibility carried a weight, and I realized that anticipation could be as punishing as confrontation. My son exhaled sharply, a subtle sign that he had reached the end of his patience or perhaps the limit of his hope. He glanced at me, eyes flicking from the envelope to my face, silently pleading for guidance, for some signal that the day wouldn't unravel entirely. I wanted to provide that, but the responsibility of preparation didn't grant me control over the hearts and minds of others. All I could do was observe, hope, and remain steadfast in the fairness that had brought us to this point. The conversation started slowly, measured, as she began pointing out minor objections, phrasing them in polite tones yet with unmistakable firmness. It was clear she had rehearsed her points, anticipated counterarguments, and meticulously built a structure to maintain authority. I could feel my son's tension rise with each statement, a mix of frustration and confusion painting his face. I wanted to intervene, to remind her that this wasn't about domination but protection, but I held back, reminding myself that this was a crucible for him as much as for her. I noticed how she emphasized certain clauses, as though expecting my son to react defensively. And he did, though subtly, small gestures, tense shoulders, the occasional word that betrayed his internal struggle. I could see the negotiation of identity and expectation taking place in real time, a delicate balance between asserting independence and maintaining harmony. It was fascinating in a painful sort of way, observing how adult children confront the realities of love, law, and family boundaries. A sudden sharp glance from her caught my attention. She had found what she was looking for, a line, a clause, a sentence that she seemed to believe gave her the moral leverage to reject the entire document. I realized with a jolt that my meticulous preparation might not have been enough. The very thing meant to protect could now be twisted, misinterpreted, or outright ignored, leaving all of us in a precarious limbo. I felt the anxiety tighten in my chest, the same sort of anxiety I had spent weeks trying to insulate against, now pressing against my ribs with unwelcome immediacy. My son, for a brief moment, seemed frozen, caught between loyalty to his fiancée and the reality of what the prenup represented. I could almost see his mind racing, calculating the consequences of either confrontation or concession. I felt the helplessness of a parent who has tried to foresee every angle, yet realizes that real life, messy, unpredictable, emotionally charged, refuses to bend neatly to careful planning. I could hear the faint shuffle of paper as she flipped through the envelope's contents, her finger landing with deliberate precision on page 2. I felt an instant chill, the realization that this was the pivot point, the critical moment where everything could shift. My son's eyes widened slightly, registering the significance before I could speak. The room's tension condensed into that singular instance. Paper, posture, anticipation, and the silent acknowledgement that the day's plan had just been subverted in the quietest, most calculated way possible. The clock on the wall ticked audibly, each second hammering the awareness of our limitations. I tried to focus on the principles behind our actions, the fairness, the protection, the desire to respect everyone's future. Yet even that grounding seemed fragile. I could see the narrative we had built, our careful reasoning, unraveling before me, one subtle gesture at a time. And still, I remained silent, knowing that words in that instant could be both a salve and a weapon, and that restraint might be the only choice to navigate the immediate storm. I realized that what had started as a careful act of preparation had become a test of character, resilience, and clarity. Not just for my son or his fiancée, but for me as well. Could I maintain composure in the face of quiet subversion? Could I model patience while knowing the emotional cost of every glance and every pause? The answer was uncertain, but the next move, inevitable, consequential, was already shaping itself in the subtle dynamics of the room. The moment my son's finger paused on page 2, the atmosphere shifted in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. It was almost imperceptible at first. His subtle intake of breath, a brief stiffening of posture, but the undercurrent of tension suddenly became undeniable. I felt as though the room itself was leaning forward, waiting for the next beat, the next reaction. I tried to focus on steadying my own pulse, reminding myself that my role was to witness, to guide with patience if necessary, but not to force outcomes. He scanned the lines carefully, his eyes moving slower than I had seen him read anything in recent memory. There was a seriousness, a weight in his expression, a recognition that what he was seeing now might irrevocably shape both his relationship and the trust between us. His fiancée maintained her composed exterior, but I could detect the faintest tension in the corner of her mouth, a slight tightening that betrayed anticipation. It was as if she expected this reading to deliver exactly what she wanted, and in some ways I understood that. I thought back to the hours I had spent preparing this prenup, the long nights reading legalese, comparing clauses, consulting quietly with experts to ensure fairness. I had thought that the effort, the thoroughness, would prevent exactly this kind of conflict. But here we were, the meticulous precautions now just pieces on a chessboard where intentions and pride carried far more influence than any legal clause. I realized with a sinking feeling that preparation can only take you so far. Human emotion rarely follows the neat paths we envision. My son's voice finally broke the silence, quiet at first, almost hesitant. He read aloud one sentence from page 2, and for a fleeting instant, I saw surprise flicker across both their faces. The words, seemingly innocuous, carried implications neither of them fully expected. There was a subtle power shift embedded in the legal language, a protection that applied equally to all parties but could easily be misunderstood. I noticed my son's eyebrows rise slightly, a silent acknowledgement of how critical it was to understand the text fully before reacting emotionally. She exhaled, a controlled but audible breath, and I could feel the tension between them sharpen. It wasn't just about a piece of paper anymore. It was about control, trust, and the unspoken agreements we make within families. I realized that this was less a legal negotiation and more a test of character. Would my son assert clarity? Would she acknowledge fairness without twisting it into leverage? Every movement, every glance, every word felt like it carried consequences far beyond what either of them may have intended. As he continued to read, I noticed the flicker of internal debate playing out in his eyes. The young man I had raised, the one I thought I knew entirely, was confronting a scenario that challenged both his loyalty and his independence. I could see the quiet calculation, balancing respect for his fiancée, loyalty to his family, and the realization that compromise might be necessary. It was a delicate act, one that demanded emotional intelligence, restraint, and courage in equal measure. I found myself holding my breath as he turned the page, the gesture deliberate, almost ceremonial. Each line carried the weight of potential conflict, and I realized anew how much we underestimate the emotional gravity of what seems like a simple agreement. What was meant to be a straightforward safeguard now felt like a pivot point, a subtle battleground for intentions, values, and unspoken fears. It was a reminder that even well-intentioned preparation can collide violently with human perception. Her expression remained calm on the surface, but I caught the slightest narrowing of her eyes. It was a signal, almost imperceptible, that she was aware of the shift, that she understood the stakes had subtly tilted. I wondered if she realized that my son's comprehension of the clause would fundamentally alter her leverage. I could see the tension in her posture, the way she positioned her hands on the table, careful but assertive, as though holding invisible reins on the unfolding drama. A pause lingered in the air after my son finished reading. Silence, not empty but thick, stretched between them. I felt the room contract around us, each second magnifying the weight of unspoken thoughts. I realized that the moment was critical not for the clause itself but for the understanding it would require. The power in that page lay not in its legal language but in the awareness it generated, the subtle illumination of truth that can neither be ignored nor dismissed. I watched him slowly fold the page and look up, meeting her eyes. The shift was almost imperceptible but profound. His tone, when he finally spoke, was steady yet firm. He articulated not defiance but clarity, a quiet assertion that while he respected her perspective, misinterpretation could not govern their decisions. It was an emotional pivot, a moment where maturity, patience, and fairness intersected with personal boundaries. I could see her process his words, the way her gaze flicked between him and the envelope, as if reconsidering not just the document but the dynamic of their relationship. I realized then that the envelope was no longer simply a legal tool. It had become a mirror, reflecting the values, priorities, and emotional literacy of everyone in the room. Every gesture, every glance, every carefully chosen word now carried double weight. What was stated and what was understood. The tension was still present, but it had transformed from a passive threat into a deliberate negotiation of understanding and respect. For the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps this confrontation, while uncomfortable and tense, would not end in resentment or broken trust. Perhaps the lesson embedded in page 2 would extend beyond legal necessity, offering a chance to communicate openly, to assert boundaries, and to negotiate fairness without succumbing to pride or manipulation. I reminded myself that the best guidance I could offer now was patience, observation, and readiness to support if needed, rather than intervening prematurely. The weight in the room remained tangible, yet lighter somehow, infused with the quiet recognition that truth and awareness often carry more power than force or insistence. My son had read, comprehended, and acknowledged, not with anger but with clarity. I could see the subtle respect forming, unspoken yet present, between the two of them. This was not resolution yet, but it was a turning point, a moment that might redefine the expectations and dynamics for the future. The room remained thick with tension long after my son had closed the prenup, but now the atmosphere had shifted from uncertainty to a quiet confrontation. I noticed subtle movements, her fingers tracing the edge of the table, his eyes darting to mine, a silent request for support or perhaps validation. I could feel the weight of every unspoken word pressing against the walls. It occurred to me that this moment was not merely about a legal document. It was about boundaries, respect, and the willingness to understand intentions without immediately assigning blame. I tried to catch my son's gaze, hoping to offer a reassuring nod, a silent reminder that clarity and patience were often stronger than confrontation. He seemed aware of my presence, yet distant in thought, navigating the invisible currents between his fiancée's expectations and the wisdom I had tried to instill over the years. I realized that his challenge now was not simply to assert knowledge of the prenup, but to assert his values, the principles that had guided him even before this engagement. Her posture remained calm, but there was a subtle shift in her expression, a tightening around her lips, a brief narrowing of the eyes. She had expected resistance, perhaps anger, but instead she found measured clarity. It was almost as if the page 2 revelation had forced a reconsideration of her assumptions. I watched her closely, wondering if she understood the depth of the change. The power she thought she had wielded with her ultimatum now seemed less absolute, and I could see the faintest trace of surprise in her reaction. My son spoke carefully, articulating not what he opposed but what he understood. He referenced the language in the prenup, pointing out areas that protected both parties equally, areas that demanded honesty and transparency rather than leverage. I could see the weight of comprehension in his posture, the quiet authority of someone who had thought carefully, who had not reacted out of anger but out of reasoned awareness. For a fleeting moment, I was reminded that true maturity often arrives in silence rather than speech, in understanding rather than confrontation. The tension in the room did not dissipate immediately, but the sharp edge had softened. I could sense a subtle recalibration of expectations, an unspoken acknowledgement that negotiation did not require submission. Each gesture, each glance, became a subtle test of patience and perception. I wondered if they realized the gravity of the moment, how the way they handled this confrontation would echo in their relationship long after the words had been spoken and the papers signed. I thought about the nights I had spent preparing this prenup, carefully balancing fairness and protection, anticipating objections, and trying to foresee emotional reactions. None of that preparation could fully account for the nuanced interplay of pride, fear, and love that now filled the room. What mattered most, I realized, was not the document itself but the lessons it created. Lessons in patience, understanding, and the courage to confront reality without letting ego dominate. She finally broke the silence, her voice measured, soft but firm. She questioned a clause, not aggressively but inquisitively, seeking clarification rather than confrontation. I could see my son pause, weighing his words, considering not just the legal accuracy but the emotional impact. Their exchange became a delicate dance, each step requiring attentiveness and care. It was a negotiation not merely of legal terms but of trust, character, and the ability to see beyond immediate desires. I felt my own emotions shift, from anxiety to cautious optimism. Watching them navigate this subtle tension reminded me of how fragile understanding can be, and how easily pride or assumption can derail relationships. Yet here, amid the quiet scrutiny and careful articulation, I glimpsed the possibility of alignment. It was not resolution, not yet, but a bridge toward it, constructed with patience and deliberate intent rather than force or coercion. I reflected on the importance of this moment for my son's growth. He had the opportunity to assert independence while remaining respectful, to challenge without alienating, to stand firm without pushing away. I realized that life rarely presents lessons in isolation. They arrive wrapped in relationships, expectations, and sometimes, the quiet tests that appear unremarkable until you pause and recognize their significance. Her demeanor gradually softened, though not completely. There was still caution, a careful assessment, but I could sense that the initial rigidity had begun to yield to possibility. My son continued to articulate his understanding, bridging gaps not just between clauses on a page but between hearts and expectations. I could see that this was an active negotiation of empathy, a test of emotional literacy that carried far more weight than any legal contract could provide. The room, once taut with anticipation, now breathed with measured intention. I observed their interaction as both participant and witness, aware of the subtle layers unfolding. Every word, every gesture, carried the potential to either strengthen understanding or ignite discord. I realized that resolution here would require ongoing attention, not just in words but in consistent actions and respect for boundaries. By the end of the afternoon, the sharp tension had softened into cautious cooperation. They had not reached full agreement, but there was mutual acknowledgement of fairness and intent. I felt a quiet relief, tempered by the understanding that this was merely a step in a longer journey. The prenup had become more than a legal safeguard. It had become a lens through which character, patience, and understanding could be measured. The evening had settled into a quiet hum, but inside the house, the tension had only deepened. After the initial exchange over the prenup, My son and his fiancée retreated into a conversation that seemed civil on the surface, but carried undercurrents of challenge and unresolved expectations. I stayed nearby, silent yet present, aware that my own interjections might either soothe or inflame. The moment demanded patience, not interference, but I could feel every subtle shift in body language, every hesitation, every carefully measured phrase. My son's voice carried calm authority, each word deliberate. He referenced sections of the prenup that she had not fully absorbed, pointing out clauses that ensured fairness for both parties. But her responses were carefully crafted defenses, not accusations but subtle tests, pushing him to reveal not only what he knew but why he knew it. I realized that this was no longer just a negotiation about a legal document. It had become a deeper test of character, resilience, and emotional awareness. I noticed a subtle tightening around her eyes whenever he mentioned the equitable clauses. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but to someone who watched closely, it revealed surprise and perhaps a grudging respect. My son, ever thoughtful, acknowledged her concerns without condescension. He offered explanations and context, not to assert superiority but to foster understanding. I felt a quiet pride, recognizing that he was navigating a delicate balance of strength and empathy, qualities I had always hoped he would embody. Yet, despite the careful words, tension flickered like a shadow across the room. I realized that the real challenge was not the prenup itself but the emotional stakes that accompanied it. Pride, insecurity, hope, and fear all mingled in a delicate dance, each waiting for the other to falter. I thought about the lessons I had tried to impart over the years, the conversations about patience and perception, and I recognized that today, they would either take root or be tested. Her questions became more probing, touching not only legal details but values, intentions, and future possibilities. I could sense her measuring the man he had become against the image she had created in her mind. My son responded with clarity and honesty, acknowledging potential risks but emphasizing trust and shared responsibility. I watched closely, noting the subtle shifts in her demeanor, the faint easing of rigidity as understanding began to emerge. The room seemed suspended in an invisible balance, each of us weighing words, gestures, and pauses. I reflected on the nature of trust, how easily it could be fractured and how painstakingly it could be rebuilt. My son had always possessed a quiet determination, a willingness to stand firm without resorting to confrontation. But today, I realized that resolve would be tested in ways that required not just firmness but patience, discernment, and empathy. She paused, her gaze falling to the table, fingers drumming lightly as if counting invisible steps. I could sense her internal struggle, the tension between expectation and reality, between assertion and acceptance. My son leaned slightly forward, maintaining eye contact but softening his tone. The dialogue between them had transformed into a delicate negotiation of trust, an unspoken acknowledgement that their decisions carried weight far beyond the document itself. I remembered my own experiences with family and negotiation, the moments when miscommunication and pride had nearly derailed relationships. I felt a pang of hope mixed with caution, realizing that this encounter was more than a legal discussion. It was a crucible for understanding, patience, and respect. I wished silently that they would recognize this opportunity, that they would see beyond immediate discomfort to the possibilities of genuine connection. Minutes passed with careful articulation, both of them navigating the thin line between assertion and concession. My son clarified points I had not even considered, framing them not as ultimatums but as guidance. She listened intently, her posture gradually relaxing, though still cautious. There was no dramatic revelation yet, no sweeping resolution, but subtle progress. A recognition that mutual understanding required effort, honesty, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. I observed them carefully, noting the small victories in comprehension and respect. Each exchange became a thread, weaving a fragile tapestry of trust and awareness. It was not a resolution but a foundation, one built from deliberate attention and careful negotiation. I realized that these moments, though seemingly ordinary, were essential to the future of their relationship and to the lessons my son was absorbing about integrity, empathy, and resilience. As the evening drew on, the conversation shifted from clauses to intentions, from stipulations to shared goals. My son spoke candidly about his vision for the future, about partnership and accountability, about values that mattered more than material concerns. Her responses grew warmer, her defenses easing as she engaged with the sincerity of his words rather than the rigidity of her expectations. I felt a subtle shift in the room, a movement toward tentative understanding, and it reminded me that patience often precedes breakthrough, not confrontation. By the time we approached nightfall, the tension had softened into cautious cooperation. They had not resolved every disagreement, but there was progress, mutual acknowledgement, tentative respect, and the beginnings of dialogue that could carry them forward. I felt a quiet relief, tempered by awareness that the work was ongoing. This negotiation had become a test of character, not just for my son and his fiancée, but for the family as a whole, a reminder that relationships demand effort, honesty, and resilience at every step. The following morning carried a quiet tension that felt heavier than the night before. Though last evening's conversation had ended with a fragile sense of progress, the air in the house remained charged, as if each word spoken had left an invisible mark. I moved about in a haze of anticipation, noticing the smallest signs: an unopened cup of coffee, a note left half-folded, a shadow lingering longer than usual across the kitchen wall. My son had retreated to his study, and she lingered in the living room, flipping through the prenup as if every sentence demanded a silent verdict. The house, which moments ago had hummed with subtle negotiation, now felt like a waiting room for an unseen verdict. I remembered the first time he had brought her home, the sparkle of excitement on his face, the nervous energy that always accompanied introductions. I had hoped that this union would carry the same innocence, a coming together of two hearts eager to build a life. But now, that hope felt complicated, like a delicate vase that had been both admired and slightly chipped. I walked toward the study door, hearing their voices rise and fall in tones that were measured but not entirely calm. Every word seemed to carry multiple layers: intentions, doubts, defenses, and tests. He spoke of compromise, of shared responsibility, of the importance of fairness and clarity in any partnership. She listened, occasionally nodding, occasionally pressing further, asking questions that seemed simple but were loaded with deeper meaning. I stayed at the threshold, silent, feeling the weight of observation. There was a subtle rhythm to their dialogue, a push and pull that required both patience and emotional insight. I understood that this was not merely about the prenup but about trust, transparency, and testing whether mutual respect could survive scrutiny. The discussion shifted from legal terms to personal expectations. She asked about family traditions, financial priorities, and boundaries, each question revealing both concern and curiosity. He responded with honesty, acknowledging his values while respecting hers. The tension in the room was tangible, but beneath it, I sensed an undercurrent of connection. Each hesitant smile, each carefully chosen word, was like a tentative bridge being laid over a river of doubt. But even as the dialogue unfolded, I sensed that unspoken questions lingered. What had caused her initial refusal to accept the prenup so firmly? Was it fear of control, a test of his loyalty, or something deeper that neither had yet articulated? I wanted to intervene, to ask the questions that hovered silently, but I restrained myself, knowing that the growth and clarity they needed would emerge only if they navigated this themselves. Her tone shifted unexpectedly, softening, and I realized she had started to see the fairness embedded in the document. Yet the pause that followed each explanation carried weight, as if she were measuring both the words and the intent behind them. My son's composure remained steady, but I could detect the quiet strain of effort, the constant balancing act of patience and assertiveness. It reminded me of the many lessons I had tried to impart over the years: strength tempered by empathy, clarity grounded in honesty. In one moment, her voice caught slightly as she referred to a clause about future family obligations. She glanced up at him, searching his expression for reassurance. He met her gaze with quiet certainty, not arrogance, but a calm confidence that seemed to say, "I see you, I respect your concerns, and together we will navigate this." It was a small gesture, but in it, I recognized a critical turning point, a demonstration that trust could be both tested and nurtured simultaneously. As the conversation progressed, the tension began to ebb subtly, replaced by a tentative collaboration. They began to discuss contingencies and scenarios, the kind that required not only legal awareness but shared moral understanding. I found myself reflecting on how life often presents situations that test character more than intellect, where integrity, patience, and empathy determine outcomes far more than clever negotiation. I took a seat in the corner, feeling both pride and apprehension. Pride because my son was demonstrating remarkable clarity and patience. Apprehension because I understood that true resolution was still far away, hidden behind layers of emotion and expectation. Each carefully measured word was a step, each silent pause a test. I realized that this moment was shaping not just their relationship, but their understanding of partnership, compromise, and mutual respect. Eventually, she leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly, and I felt a subtle shift. There was no triumphant declaration, no dramatic victory, but a fragile sense of equilibrium had begun to form. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, but significant. A recognition that the path forward required collaboration and acknowledgement rather than rigid adherence to initial positions. I reflected on the journey so far, the emotional turbulence, the silent observations, the careful negotiations. I realized that these moments, though fraught with tension, were laying the groundwork for understanding and empathy. They were learning not only about legal documents and obligations but about the deeper currents of human connection, the ways trust is built, tested, and ultimately strengthened. As the day waned, I found myself quietly hopeful. The prenup, which had seemed a point of contention, had transformed into a catalyst for dialogue and comprehension. The real work lay in navigating the emotional landscape, acknowledging fears, and fostering mutual respect. I knew that the road ahead would remain challenging, but the first steps had been taken. And in that quiet, observant space, I felt the beginnings of a fragile hope that trust, patience, and empathy might yet prevail. The morning air was heavier than usual, and even the soft hum of the refrigerator seemed louder, reminding me that silence can weigh more than words. I had thought yesterday's tentative progress would carry us forward, but as soon as I stepped into the living room, the tension returned like a shadow refusing to leave. My son and his fiancée were seated across from each other, the prenup lying untouched between them. Neither spoke immediately. Instead, they measured one another with cautious eyes, like two players in a slow, deliberate game where every gesture held meaning. I lingered by the doorway, sensing the subtle shift that had begun overnight. The previous day's calm had only masked deeper uncertainties. I remembered a time when trust between us had been simpler, uncomplicated by legal documents or emotional tests. Now every glance, every sigh seemed to echo unspoken doubts. It was strange to witness the same people I had raised navigating a complex web of negotiation and emotion, learning lessons that could not be taught through words alone. She broke the silence first, her voice tentative but firm. She raised concerns about future disagreements, about what might happen if promises were broken. Her questions, though phrased carefully, cut to the heart of trust itself, forcing him to confront scenarios he had never considered. He responded with patience, yet I could see the strain behind his calm. Each answer required reflection, each pause a careful weighing of values against expectations. I realized that their dialogue was not just about a document but about understanding the unspoken rules of partnership, respect, and mutual commitment. I thought about the years I had spent trying to instill principles in him: honesty, empathy, strength, and patience. Now those lessons were being tested in real time, and I could see their impact, subtle but undeniable. He listened, sometimes nodded, sometimes paused, never defensive but always present. The room held a delicate tension that I could feel physically, pressing against the walls, lingering in the space between them. At one point, she questioned a clause about property and financial control, her voice carrying a mixture of frustration and fear. I sensed that this was more than a legal issue. It was an emotional test, a way to measure his willingness to compromise without losing integrity. He replied with clarity, acknowledging her concerns while reaffirming his own boundaries. The careful balance of assertiveness and empathy was impressive, yet I could feel the undercurrent of doubt that still pulsed quietly, reminding me that resolution would not come easily. Her eyes met his, searching for an unspoken truth. He met them with a gentle steadiness that seemed to say, "I understand, I respect your fears, and I will not let them be dismissed." It was a small moment, yet profoundly significant. I could see the seeds of trust being planted, tiny but resilient, in a soil that had previously seemed rocky and uncertain. I moved quietly to the corner of the room, feeling both an observer and a participant. Their conversation shifted to more personal matters, family expectations, past mistakes, and the weight of history. I realized that the prenup had become a catalyst, bringing to the surface not only practical concerns but emotional ones that neither had fully acknowledged. Each question, each response, peeled back a layer of pretense, revealing vulnerabilities and intentions. They began discussing possible outcomes of disagreements, ways to support each other while respecting boundaries. It was exhausting to watch, not because of its length, but because it required both emotional courage and clarity of thought. I reflected on how often life presents challenges where intellect alone is insufficient, where character, patience, and understanding determine the outcome. My son was demonstrating remarkable maturity, navigating tension without succumbing to frustration, while she tested the depth of his commitment without abandoning her own integrity. The conversation continued, stretching into hours, yet I felt a subtle shift in atmosphere. The air, once thick with uncertainty, began to carry a sense of mutual recognition. Not complete trust, not yet, but the understanding that they were willing to engage with each other authentically. I noticed small gestures, a hand brushing a stray strand of hair, a nod of acknowledgement, a pause that allowed thought before response. These tiny, almost imperceptible actions spoke volumes about their willingness to meet each other halfway. I recalled similar moments in my own life, times when patience and listening had changed outcomes more than confrontation ever could. I realized that the current struggle was not merely about legal documents or family expectations, but about navigating human emotion, understanding boundaries, and fostering mutual respect. It was a lesson in resilience, negotiation, and the often overlooked art of empathy. By late afternoon, the room held a fragile sense of equilibrium. There were no declarations of victory, no dramatic breakthroughs, only the quiet realization that communication, patience, and honesty were beginning to yield results. I felt a cautious optimism, understanding that the path ahead would remain challenging, but the first genuine steps toward resolution had been taken. The day ended with both of them pausing, the prenup still between them, but with a new sense of possibility. It was no longer a battleground but a tool for dialogue, a means to explore values, boundaries, and trust. As I watched them in that quiet moment, I felt a mixture of relief, pride, and anticipation. The real work was still to come, yet the foundation had begun to form, a foundation built on patience, empathy, and the courage to face difficult truths together. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds in thin, uncertain stripes, as if the world itself hesitated to shine fully on what had become a fragile truce. I walked into the kitchen, half expecting the previous day's cautious progress to carry over, but the tension lingered in the air like smoke that refused to dissipate. My son sat at the table, eyes focused on the prenup again, while she hovered near the counter, arms crossed, a subtle defensive posture that betrayed her inner unease. The silence was different this time, heavier, more charged, as though yesterday's conversations had only scratched the surface. I poured myself a cup of coffee, noticing how even the simplest morning ritual felt complicated now. Each sip reminded me that nothing about this process was straightforward. I remembered when he had been a child, when problems could be solved with a comforting word or a small act of reassurance. Now, the stakes were higher and the dynamics more complex. I realized that our roles had shifted. I was no longer just a parent guiding him, but an observer witnessing the evolution of trust, communication, and boundaries. She finally spoke, her voice steadier than I anticipated. She asked a question about future financial decisions, testing not just the details of the prenup but his ability to listen, consider, and respond with honesty and fairness. He paused, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. I could see the weight of his reflection, the internal debate between protecting his own interests and showing empathy toward her concerns. It was fascinating and nerve-wracking to watch, knowing that every answer carried consequences beyond the document itself. The conversation stretched, revealing unspoken fears and assumptions. She admitted doubts about family influence and possible interference from me, her tone vulnerable yet guarded. My heart ached at the implied critique, not personal but rooted in a mixture of concern and mistrust. I stayed silent, allowing them space to navigate these layers of emotion. It was one of the hardest roles I had ever held, present but invisible, supportive without imposing. At one point, he asked her a question I hadn't expected. What were her true fears beyond finances? Her eyes softened, and she began sharing memories of past relationships where trust had been broken, explaining how that shaped her insistence on the prenup. I realized in that moment that this was less about legal documents and more about emotional security. My son listened with patience, never dismissive, never impatient. His ability to absorb and respond to her vulnerability with calm honesty struck me. Hours passed, and I found myself reflecting on the lessons embedded in this tense exchange. Life often presents challenges where character, empathy, and patience are more critical than intellect or preparation. My son was demonstrating qualities I had hoped to nurture, while she navigated the complex interplay of fear, expectation, and love. Their dialogue was raw yet constructive, each difficult question met with care, each concern answered with intention. I marveled at how even conflict could foster growth if approached with honesty and respect. Then came a subtle but significant turning point. She hesitated, flipping to page 2 of the prenup. He leaned forward, reading with a focused intensity that suggested he understood more than just the words. He understood the underlying intentions, the assumptions, and the potential consequences of every clause. The room grew still, the kind of silence that carries the weight of revelation. I could sense the tension transform, shifting from fear and suspicion to the potential for insight and understanding. As he continued reading, I noticed her body language change as well. Arms uncrossed slightly, shoulders relaxing. It was not an immediate breakthrough but a signal that the foundation for mutual comprehension was forming. They were beginning to see each other beyond the document, glimpsing intentions and character rather than just legalese. I felt a cautious sense of relief, realizing that the prenup, once a symbol of mistrust, had become a framework for dialogue, negotiation, and, ultimately, connection. I observed them discussing contingencies, exploring scenarios I had not anticipated. They considered how life might challenge their trust and what strategies they could employ to maintain mutual respect and understanding. It was painstakingly meticulous, yet profoundly human. I was reminded that real commitment involves navigating complexity, embracing vulnerability, and negotiating differences without sacrificing integrity. Their evolving conversation reflected these truths. By late afternoon, a subtle shift had taken place. The prenup remained on the table, but it no longer felt like a barrier. Instead, it was a tool that allowed honesty and dialogue to flourish. Each clause became a springboard for deeper understanding, each question an opportunity to reveal character and intention. I realized that while the document had initiated conflict, it was also catalyzing a more authentic connection. I retreated to the living room, reflecting on the delicate balance they were achieving. I thought about the many times in life when misunderstanding could have led to resentment, when fear could have overshadowed potential for trust. This moment was different. They were actively choosing to engage, to question, to listen, and to respond thoughtfully. It was exhausting but necessary, a test of resilience, patience, and emotional intelligence. As evening approached, I felt a cautious optimism. No definitive conclusions had been reached, but the groundwork had been laid. They were beginning to navigate the complexities of love, trust, and partnership with intentionality and care. I sensed that the real work was just beginning, yet I also recognized that this initial engagement could shape the trajectory of their relationship in profound ways. The day ended quietly, with both of them pausing, prenup still in view, but now a symbol of their willingness to confront hard truths and explore shared values. I felt a mixture of pride, relief, and anticipation, knowing that the challenges ahead would require more dialogue, understanding, and emotional courage. The journey was far from over, but the first steps toward mutual comprehension and trust had been taken, and that was a start worth acknowledging. The following morning brought a quiet tension with it, the kind that lingers in the air before words are spoken. I sat on the edge of the couch, coffee in hand, watching the two of them move through the kitchen with a careful precision, each gesture measured, each glance laden with unspoken meaning. The prenup still lay on the table, a silent sentinel of everything that had passed between us, a reminder of mistrust but also a beacon for dialogue. My son traced the rim of his mug, seemingly lost in thought, while she arranged plates with a methodical patience that hinted at her own inner negotiation. I thought back to yesterday, to the moment he had read page 2, when a subtle shift had begun to emerge. It was not immediate or dramatic, but noticeable in the way his eyes met hers without defensiveness, in the way she allowed a fraction of vulnerability to show through her otherwise guarded demeanor. I wondered if they realized just how delicate this balance had become, the interplay of trust, fear, and expectation that defined the space between them. She spoke first, her voice careful but steady, posing a question about joint financial planning and the contingencies we had discussed the night before. My son responded thoughtfully, pausing to consider each detail. I could see the mental effort it took, the weighing of principles against emotion, practicality against the desire to show goodwill. Watching him navigate these subtle negotiations, I felt both pride and concern, acutely aware that the path forward required patience, empathy, and clarity in equal measure. Their discussion expanded naturally into broader questions about life together, shared responsibilities, the role of extended family, even mundane household routines. Each answer, each clarification, seemed to carry more weight than the words themselves, revealing character, priorities, and values. I was struck by the realization that this conversation, catalyzed by a legal document, was now becoming a crucible for understanding, a way for them to probe each other's hearts and intentions without fear of judgment. Mid-morning, my son paused and looked at me with a question that made me catch my breath. Was I prepared to support them without influencing the outcome? I nodded, even though inwardly I felt the tension of maintaining neutrality while also protecting him from potential heartbreak. I realized that my role had changed again. I was no longer the decision-maker or the guide but a witness, a stabilizing presence who could offer counsel only when sought. It was an exercise in restraint, trust, and humility, and I felt the weight of it keenly. She observed him closely, her tone softening as she asked about his long-term vision and dreams, not just financially but emotionally. He answered with honesty, weaving together hope, caution, and personal values in a way that demonstrated both growth and maturity. I noted her reaction, the slight relaxation in her posture, the small nods that punctuated the conversation, as evidence that connection was forming, fragile yet persistent. The prenup had started as a wedge, but now it was subtly transforming into a tool for dialogue, a medium for truth-telling that had previously been avoided. As the morning wore on, I noticed moments of tension arise. Misunderstandings, minor disagreements about phrasing or intent, but each was met with discussion rather than confrontation. The careful, deliberate way they navigated these challenges left me in awe. I realized that negotiation of this kind required more than intellect. It demanded patience, humility, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths without retreating. By early afternoon, we had all settled into an unspoken rhythm. Conversations flowed, occasionally punctuated by laughter, but always anchored in the prenup's presence. I reflected on how a simple document could reveal so much about human nature, the fears, priorities, and unspoken agreements that define relationships long before vows are exchanged. I thought about my son, about the responsibility he carried to balance love, loyalty, and foresight, and I admired the quiet strength he displayed under scrutiny. Then a subtle moment occurred, almost imperceptible. She made a suggestion about an adjustment, not as a demand but as an invitation to mutual compromise. My son considered it, asked clarifying questions, and then responded with a counterpoint that showed both respect and discernment. In that exchange, I saw a microcosm of what marriage might demand of them: negotiation, understanding, and the ability to reconcile differences without resentment. It was a small but profound insight into their evolving dynamic. I left the kitchen for a short break, standing by the window and watching the light shift across the lawn. Even in the quiet, I felt the undercurrent of tension and trust. Each of them had revealed vulnerabilities, each had asked difficult questions, and each had responded with a measure of honesty that I hadn't anticipated. It was not resolution, not yet, but it was progress, the kind that matters most in the long arc of relationships. When I returned, the conversation had taken a more reflective tone. They discussed what would happen if unforeseen challenges arose: career changes, family emergencies, or personal setbacks. Their discussion was pragmatic, yet it carried emotional weight, highlighting the real-life stakes behind what once seemed like abstract clauses. I realized in that moment that the prenup was not a symbol of distrust but an instrument to explore how trust could be sustained even in uncertainty. As the day wound down, I felt the subtle, tentative shift in energy that had begun yesterday now consolidating. They had reached moments of mutual understanding, experienced brief sparks of connection, and, importantly, recognized the need for ongoing dialogue. It was exhausting, yes, but deeply meaningful. I felt a sense of cautious optimism, knowing that the foundations of communication, respect, and transparency were beginning to take root. By evening, we sat quietly together, not in tension but in shared reflection. The prenup remained present, a reminder of the work done and the work yet to come. I realized that this day had offered more than just practical negotiation. It had provided insight into character, emotional intelligence, and the delicate art of compromise. I felt gratitude that we could navigate this process with patience and care, recognizing the fragility and potential of trust as it was being rebuilt. As night fell, I contemplated the lessons embedded in these hours: the importance of listening, the courage to confront difficult truths, and the transformative power of dialogue grounded in respect. The prenup was no longer merely a piece of paper. It had become a mirror, reflecting values, priorities, and the potential for growth. And while no final decisions had been reached, the day had shown me that even in the midst of conflict and hesitation, understanding was possible, and connection could emerge from deliberate, patient conversation. The next morning arrived with a quiet urgency that I could feel the moment I opened my eyes. The previous day's negotiations and tentative breakthroughs had left a residue of tension, like an echo that didn't fully fade with the night. I found myself pacing the living room, a cup of lukewarm tea clutched in my hands, thinking over every exchange, every glance, and every word that had passed between my son and his fiancée. There was so much at stake, yet I knew the most critical moments often passed silently, between the lines of conversation. I remembered him reading page 2 yesterday, his eyes flickering with understanding and unease. That single act had shifted the energy between them, altering the trajectory of not only the discussion but of trust itself. I had underestimated how much courage it would take for him to confront the truths embedded in that document, and now I realized how delicate the next steps needed to be. I wondered if she truly grasped the implications of what she was rejecting and whether this standoff would forge a stronger bond or fracture it further. By mid-morning, they had reconvened in the study, the prenup laid out between them like a bridge demanding traversal. I lingered outside the doorway, listening to fragments of their dialogue, careful not to intrude yet unable to resist the pull of curiosity. She asked pointed questions about assets, but beneath her careful phrasing was a subtle plea for reassurance, a need to gauge character beyond the words on paper. My son responded with patience, detailing not just the facts but his reasoning, attempting to meet her apprehension with transparency rather than defensiveness. I noticed a quiet intensity in her expression, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. She hesitated at several points, not out of stubbornness, but as if weighing her own expectations against the reality of what he offered. There was a microcosm of negotiation happening beyond finances. It was about trust, values, and the ability to navigate discomfort without collapsing into argument. I marveled at the skill required to manage this delicate interplay, recognizing that every sentence, pause, and inflection carried emotional weight far beyond its literal meaning. In one particularly revealing moment, she raised a hypothetical scenario about family disagreements that could potentially escalate into conflict. He answered thoughtfully, acknowledging his own flaws while outlining strategies for communication and compromise. It struck me how his capacity for reflection had deepened since the prenup had first been introduced. It was as if the document, once a wedge, had inadvertently created a space for honesty and personal growth. I stepped into the room briefly to refill their water glasses, and their eyes met mine with a subtle acknowledgement that we were all navigating this together. I refrained from offering advice. Instead, I simply allowed presence to speak where words could not. There was a fragile rhythm to the dialogue, one built on listening, clarifying, and gentle assertion, and I felt both pride and apprehension witnessing it. Pride for the maturity my son exhibited and apprehension because I knew that understanding could still unravel if either party became too rigid or defensive. By noon, the conversation had shifted toward future planning. She inquired about their visions for life together, not in abstract terms but in tangible, practical ways. My son responded candidly, outlining his career aspirations, household routines, and personal values, showing a willingness to integrate her perspective into a shared vision. I was struck by the subtle balance he maintained, honoring his principles while adapting to her needs, reflecting emotional intelligence that had perhaps only been latent until tested by this situation. A moment of tension arose when she questioned a clause concerning family gifts and inheritance. His initial response was measured but firm, emphasizing fairness and transparency. Yet, rather than escalating, she paused and proposed an alternative that invited dialogue rather than confrontation. I realized that the success of this negotiation depended not on winning or losing, but on the capacity to entertain difference without resentment, a lesson that extended far beyond legal agreements. As the afternoon sun streamed through the study window, I observed them navigating smaller details with the same care they had shown in larger matters. Each discussion, no matter how minor, revealed layers of character and compatibility, forcing both to confront personal assumptions and expectations. The prenup had begun as a symbol of potential conflict, but was now transforming into a mirror, reflecting both their insecurities and their commitment to clarity. I took a brief walk outside to collect my thoughts, noticing the subtle shifts in the environment. The wind moving leaves, the distant hum of neighbors, the quiet persistence of normalcy juxtaposed against the charged discussions inside. These contrasts reminded me that life's pivotal moments are often embedded within ordinary routines, and the courage to face uncomfortable truths is what separates fleeting understanding from lasting connection. Returning to the room, I found a turning point. She acknowledged the effort and integrity in his approach, conceding that her initial resistance had perhaps been informed more by fear than mistrust. He responded with gratitude, not arrogance, recognizing the weight of her vulnerability. That acknowledgement, simple yet profound, seemed to dissolve some of the tension and allowed a tentative bridge of mutual respect to form. By evening, the atmosphere had softened. There was no full resolution, but a newfound willingness to listen and accommodate had emerged. The prenup remained, but it no longer loomed as a threat. Instead, it had become a framework for understanding, guiding them to confront uncomfortable topics with intention rather than avoidance. I felt a cautious optimism, aware that the day's progress was fragile yet significant. As I prepared dinner, I reflected on the lessons of patience, empathy, and emotional resilience that had surfaced over the hours. My son and his fiancée had engaged in a delicate dance of negotiation and understanding, revealing both their strengths and vulnerabilities. It was a reminder that relationships, like legal agreements, require clarity, honesty, and the courage to confront difficult truths, and that trust, once tested, can deepen rather than fracture when handled with care. The evening had settled into a quiet rhythm, though the weight of the day still lingered between us like an unspoken presence. I could hear the soft murmur of their conversation from the kitchen doorway, snippets of dialogue that carried the subtle tension and careful consideration of two people attempting to reconcile expectations with reality. I stayed close, not to intrude, but because every word now felt like a clue to understanding how this fragile balance might hold or fracture. I thought about how far we had come since the initial standoff over the prenup. What began as a sharp divide had slowly evolved into cautious negotiation, with each party beginning to reveal layers of character that had been hidden beneath fear or pride. My son's patience was evident in the careful phrasing of his words, the measured tone that never sought to dominate but to explain, to invite understanding rather than insist on compliance. And her responses, once rigid and defensive, now hinted at reflection, the way her eyes softened at certain admissions, the subtle nods that suggested acknowledgement rather than capitulation. At one point, she paused mid-sentence, caught between insisting on a clause and recognizing the spirit behind his intentions. It was a microcosm of everything this negotiation represented, something far deeper than legal documents. I realized that the prenup had become a mirror, reflecting their values, insecurities, and willingness to trust each other under pressure. I could almost feel the invisible threads of compromise stretching but not breaking, delicate yet tenacious. I took a moment to step outside for fresh air, my mind replaying the earlier exchanges. I remembered my own father, and how he had approached similar conflicts with a mix of authority and restraint, and I wondered if some of this patience was inherited. Standing there, I noticed the quiet of the street, the gentle rustle of trees, and the distant hum of life carrying on indifferent to our familial negotiations. It was a reminder that personal struggles exist in the midst of ordinary life, often unnoticed by anyone outside the immediate circle. Returning to the living room, I observed them working through yet another detail: how to approach family celebrations, which had always been a source of tension. She asked pointed but fair questions about boundaries and expectations, revealing her own concerns about respect and acknowledgement. He responded with empathy, recognizing her fears without dismissing them, offering examples from past experiences where compromise had preserved both dignity and harmony. It struck me how negotiation, when coupled with sincere listening, could transform potential conflict into understanding. By late evening, the room had shifted in tone. While not entirely free of tension, the conversation carried a rhythm of mutual acknowledgement. They were beginning to understand that the prenup was not merely a document of protection or distrust, but a framework for honesty and clarity. My son's willingness to read and address page 2 had been pivotal, showing her that he was not avoiding difficult truths, and her gradual acceptance of this openness revealed her own capacity for reflection. A moment of levity arrived unexpectedly. She made a dry, almost joking remark about how they might have avoided half the stress if they had read page 2 together first. They both laughed, the sound light but sincere, and I felt a wave of relief. Humor, I realized, had a remarkable way of diffusing tension, creating a shared experience that reminded them they were still a team navigating challenges together, rather than adversaries in a legal debate. As the night deepened, we moved toward discussing the future in practical terms. She asked about his career priorities, long-term living arrangements, and even financial planning beyond the immediate prenup. His answers were honest, sometimes admitting gaps in knowledge or foresight, but always coupled with a commitment to learn and adapt. I was struck by the transparency and humility on display, qualities that no legal agreement could guarantee but which the prenup had indirectly encouraged to surface. Eventually, the conversation wound down, leaving a quiet sense of accomplishment in its wake. They were not fully resolved, but the friction had softened into a mutual understanding that would require continued communication, patience, and intentionality. I felt a mixture of relief and anticipation, aware that the next steps would test both their resilience and their commitment, yet hopeful that the lessons learned today would guide them. I reflected on my own role, observing without dominating, providing support without dictating outcomes. It was a delicate balance, mirroring the dynamics I had witnessed between them. Sometimes, The greatest help is restraint, the willingness to let those you care for navigate their own challenges while remaining a steady presence. I understood, perhaps more deeply than before, that trust is cultivated in the spaces where guidance is offered thoughtfully, but decisions are made independently. As the clock edged toward midnight, I noticed their posture and expressions. Less rigid, more relaxed, though still conscious of boundaries. The prenup remained unsigned, but its presence had catalyzed conversations that might not have occurred otherwise. I felt a quiet sense of hope, a recognition that even in moments of potential conflict, growth and understanding could emerge if approached with patience and empathy. The morning sunlight spilled through the kitchen window, catching the edges of the prenup laid across the table. Its presence was still formidable, a silent reminder of yesterday's tension and the unspoken questions that lingered between them. I watched from the doorway, hesitant to interrupt, as they reviewed the document again, this time with a softer air, curiosity mixed with caution rather than confrontation. He traced the fine print with his finger, reading aloud select phrases that had caught his attention. I could sense the care in his voice, a deliberate effort to understand the meaning rather than react emotionally. She leaned in, eyes narrowing slightly, not in anger, but in focus. There was an unspoken agreement to give each clause its due weight. It struck me how a single page could hold such significance, yet also serve as a gateway to deeper understanding about trust, boundaries, and shared responsibility. I reflected on the irony of the situation. A document meant to safeguard finances and prevent conflict had become an instrument for emotional clarity. Each line read aloud prompted questions about priorities, expectations, and the future they imagined together. I noticed small gestures, her hand brushing his briefly when emphasizing a point, his subtle nod in acknowledgement, that conveyed an unspoken bond forming amid the legal language. As the conversation progressed, tensions surfaced briefly. She paused, her eyes betraying a flash of frustration over phrasing she felt was limiting or unfair. He responded with measured calm, not dismissing her concerns, but inviting her to explain. That moment, delicate as it was, revealed a shift from adversaries to collaborators. Neither had fully mastered diplomacy yet, but both were learning to listen with intent rather than defensiveness. I thought back to my own experiences with conflict and compromise. There were times I had bristled at challenges, insisting on my viewpoint while missing the subtle truth behind another's perspective. Watching them navigate these negotiations, I realized how transformative patience could be, not merely for resolving disagreements, but for building empathy and mutual respect. The prenup had inadvertently created a framework for this learning, even if neither of them saw it that way initially. They broke briefly for coffee, and I could sense the relief in shared silence. The room felt lighter, a contrast to the dense tension of prior days. I noticed how body language now communicated more than words. Relaxed shoulders, occasional smiles, leaning slightly toward each other rather than away. Even without the prenup being signed, there was a sense of progress that could not be quantified on paper. When they resumed, the conversation turned toward contingencies, hypothetical scenarios meant to test their understanding of each other. She asked pointed questions about family emergencies, financial setbacks, and career shifts. He responded with honesty, admitting uncertainty where it existed, but also demonstrating a willingness to adjust. It was a revealing exercise, one that exposed vulnerabilities while simultaneously fostering trust. I could feel the emotional stakes rise and fall with each exchange, the tension palpable yet purposeful. I stepped out to make some calls, but my attention remained split between my own tasks and the sound of their ongoing discussion. I caught fragments of laughter, a sigh of exasperation, and soft-spoken agreements. Each auditory clue suggested movement toward reconciliation, yet I knew the resolution was fragile, dependent on continued effort and commitment. By late afternoon, they began summarizing points of agreement and lingering areas of uncertainty. It was not a complete resolution, but a roadmap for navigating challenges together. I felt an unexpected surge of pride, not in the prenup itself, but in witnessing their evolving approach to partnership. Legal documents could outline responsibilities, but it was their willingness to communicate, compromise, and reflect that would ultimately determine the success of their relationship. As evening approached, I reflected privately on the lessons of the day. The prenup, once a symbol of mistrust, had become a catalyst for dialogue, growth, and cautious optimism. It reminded me that conflict often carries within it the seeds of understanding, provided both parties are willing to tend them. I understood now that these negotiations were not just about money or property. They were about values, integrity, and the courage to face uncomfortable truths together. I returned to the living room just as they were concluding their session, noticing the subtle shifts in demeanor. They were still tense, still cautious, but there was a shared sense of accomplishment. I realized that even without final signatures, the day had marked a turning point. They had begun to see each other not as opponents, but as partners navigating a complex future together. The night settled quietly over the house, but I could still hear the occasional rustle of papers from the study. They had taken the prenup back to examine it again, though this time the atmosphere was softer, tinged with curiosity rather than confrontation. I paused at the threshold, unsure if I should intrude or simply witness from a distance. There was something compelling about seeing them wrestle with expectations and realities, testing the contours of their future together without anyone dictating the terms. He read aloud a clause that concerned financial independence, and she interjected with a question that revealed her priorities, not just about money, but about respect and shared accountability. His response was patient, measured, deliberate, a sign that he had absorbed more from their prior discussions than I had realized. I felt a quiet admiration for his ability to navigate delicate exchanges without letting ego or defensiveness dominate. As they spoke, I remembered my own early experiences with negotiations, both personal and professional. The tension, the careful articulation, the unspoken stakes. It was all familiar, yet different. Here, the stakes were intensely intimate, touching not only on practical matters but on the emotional foundation of a relationship. I reflected on the lessons I had learned the hard way, listening before reacting, questioning assumptions, and acknowledging vulnerabilities instead of masking them. The discussion drifted into hypotheticals, unexpected expenses, family emergencies, career shifts. Each scenario prompted a revealing exchange, admissions of doubt, acknowledgments of values, and an unspoken desire to find common ground. She challenged his assumptions gently, while he invited her reasoning rather than contesting it outright. I could feel the subtle shift. What had started as a standoff was evolving into a dialogue grounded in empathy and mutual respect. I stepped back and allowed myself a moment of observation. Their body language was instructive. Small nods, brief smiles, leaning toward each other at points of agreement. Even the silence between questions carried significance, signaling thoughtfulness rather than disconnection. The prenup, in its rigid formality, had become a medium for emotional calibration, teaching them to articulate their needs while understanding the other's perspective. It struck me how much unspoken history influenced the conversation. He had inherited a certain respect for transparency, while she approached negotiations with caution born of previous disappointments. Each brought a distinct lens to the discussion, yet the process was revealing how differences, when approached with patience, could complement rather than clash. I found myself considering the invisible threads that weave relationships together, the quiet understanding, the mutual willingness to adjust, the recognition that intentions matter as much as outcomes. Late into the evening, a breakthrough emerged, not dramatic, but subtle. She acknowledged a point he had made about flexibility in financial planning, and he, in turn, admitted he had underestimated her concerns about autonomy. It was a small moment, almost imperceptible, yet powerful in the context of days of tension. I felt the weight of that quiet reconciliation, the kind that doesn't announce itself with fanfare but leaves a lasting impression. I poured a cup of tea and joined them, my presence unthreatening yet supportive. They welcomed my input in passing, more as a shared reflection than a directive. I could see how my previous advice had shaped their dialogue, even if neither explicitly referenced it. There was a rhythm forming, a mutual acknowledgement that while documents could outline responsibilities, the essence of partnership relied on understanding, respect, and emotional agility. The night grew deeper, and the house seemed to breathe with a softer energy. I considered the paradox. A legal document, intended to protect against conflict, had instead illuminated the path toward connection. Their exchange had revealed not just concerns about money, but about trust, integrity, and shared vision. The words on the page mattered, certainly, but the process of navigating them together mattered even more. By the time they paused for a break, I sensed a tentative relief. There was still more to resolve, more conversations to have, but the atmosphere had shifted from adversarial to exploratory. They were beginning to see the potential for collaboration rather than opposition. I reflected on my role in this, an observer, a guide, a silent witness to growth, and felt a quiet satisfaction that progress often comes in these nuanced, patient ways rather than dramatic gestures. As I prepared for bed, I realized the day's lessons extended beyond their immediate conflict. I thought about how negotiation, compromise, and careful listening could transform relationships of all kinds. The evening had reminded me that even deeply personal disputes could evolve into opportunities for empathy, insight, and connection, provided each party approached the conversation with humility and intent. The following morning felt unusually quiet, as though the house itself was holding its breath. I lingered in the kitchen, cup of coffee in hand, listening to the distant sounds of movement from the study. Their conversation from the night before had left traces in the air, an almost tangible shift from tension to tentative understanding. I reflected on how fragile progress could feel, even after a breakthrough. One misstep, one poorly chosen word, and the fragile balance might collapse. He emerged first, notebook in hand, eyes thoughtful but calmer than the day before. She followed a few moments later, carrying her own stack of papers, a hesitant smile touching her lips. It was small, but in that gesture lay a hint of reconciliation, an acknowledgement that yesterday's discord was not the final word. I felt a flicker of relief and curiosity. How would they continue to navigate this delicate terrain now that the first cracks in communication had appeared? They invited me to sit with them briefly, and I noticed how the room's energy had changed. The formality of the prenup still loomed, but it was no longer a battleground. Instead, it served as a framework around which they could articulate expectations, confront uncertainties, and explore mutual compromises. Each page turned brought another insight, another chance for clarity, and I found myself silently admiring their willingness to engage in difficult conversations without resorting to defensiveness. The dialogue moved from specific clauses to broader implications, the meaning of partnership, the role of autonomy, and the importance of trust. She asked questions that went beyond finances, probing how he would handle disagreements, shared responsibilities, and family obligations. His responses were measured, thoughtful, and at times vulnerable, revealing not just intentions but underlying values. It was a different kind of negotiation, one that involved heart as much as logic. I noticed small gestures that spoke volumes. Leaning closer to indicate attention, brief touches on the arm for reassurance, shared laughter at a minor misunderstanding. These were not grand declarations, but the subtleties of human connection, the unspoken recognition that compromise and empathy are active processes, not passive resolutions. Observing them, I realized the prenup had inadvertently become a tool for emotional calibration, teaching lessons that extended far beyond legal matters. During a pause, she expressed concern about a hypothetical scenario in which financial disagreements might arise. He responded with transparency, outlining a step-by-step approach that emphasized communication and mutual consent. It was a moment of vulnerability, a rare glimpse of genuine intention that signaled growth. I could see the internal calculation in her eyes, the assessment of whether his assurances were credible, and then, slowly, the recognition that they were building a foundation together rather than defending positions. I reflected on my own past, on times when negotiations, professional, personal, or familial, had lacked such nuance. The stakes had often been misread, the emotional currents ignored, and the outcomes compromised. Watching them navigate these waters with attentiveness and respect felt both reassuring and instructive. It reminded me that the right approach could transform potential conflict into opportunity for understanding, provided each party was willing to engage authentically. They revisited contentious points from the previous night, unpacking assumptions and clarifying intentions. I marveled at the patience each showed, how carefully they balanced assertiveness with receptiveness. She acknowledged areas where she had perhaps been rigid, and he admitted moments where he had underestimated her perspective. The process was painstaking, but it carried a quiet dignity, a testament to the possibility of collaboration even when differences seem irreconcilable. As the morning turned into afternoon, a rhythm emerged. Questions were raised, reflections offered, and compromises tentatively accepted. Each step forward was small but significant, a brick in the structure of trust they were building together. I remained mostly silent, observing, occasionally offering insight, but largely allowing them space to negotiate the emotional as well as practical dimensions of their agreement. The day ended with a sense of cautious optimism. They had not resolved everything, but they had opened channels of communication that were previously closed. I felt a mixture of relief and pride, witnessing not just a negotiation over legal terms, but the maturation of two individuals learning to navigate partnership with empathy, clarity, and patience. The prenup, once a source of potential conflict, had become a tool for understanding, a mirror reflecting their shared and divergent priorities alike. Later, as I retreated to my own space, I considered the broader lessons of the day. Relationships, like legal agreements, are rarely simple or static. They require ongoing attention, willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, and the humility to adjust as circumstances evolve. Observing their journey reminded me that progress is often incremental, revealed in subtle shifts rather than dramatic transformations. By the late afternoon, the tension that had gripped the house for days had softened into a fragile calm. I watched from my corner, feeling both relieved and reflective. The journey from confrontation to understanding had been painstaking, marked by small victories and occasional regressions. Yet, there was a rhythm to their interactions now, a give and take that suggested the possibility of lasting compromise. It was remarkable to witness how the initial storm had not destroyed them but instead revealed the resilience beneath. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes after a long discussion over a particularly contentious clause. She, too, seemed weary yet alert, scanning the document for any lingering ambiguities. I could see her internal struggle, balancing self-interest with trust, and I admired the care she took in considering his perspective. The prenup, once a source of potential division, had transformed into a catalyst for dialogue and self-reflection. It was no longer just a legal document but a map of intentions, vulnerabilities, and shared priorities. I noticed the subtle gestures that punctuated their conversation. A nod to a firm understanding, a brief smile signaling acknowledgement, a pause that invited honesty. These moments, though small, carried enormous weight. They were the quiet proofs of engagement, indicators that both parties were willing to meet in the middle rather than retreat to entrenched positions. Observing them, I was struck by the difference between simply reading an agreement and truly inhabiting it, by the emotional labor required to make words on paper translate into mutual trust. They revisited the final pages together, each sentence sparking conversation, negotiation, and clarification. I saw him point to a section and suggest an alternative phrasing that preserved the intent while addressing her concern. She, in turn, offered a nuanced adjustment that acknowledged his priorities without compromising her own. The dialogue was iterative and patient, a far cry from the rigid standoff that had marked the initial encounter. It was a testament to the potential of compromise when both parties actively listen and respond thoughtfully. At one point, she paused and looked directly at him, asking a question that went beyond the confines of the document. What would happen if the unexpected arose? If life tested their assumptions? He took a moment, choosing his words carefully, and answered with honesty and measured confidence. It was a conversation that extended past financial terms, touching on partnership, trust, and resilience. The transparency was disarming and necessary, bridging gaps that no legal clause alone could cover. I felt a swell of pride watching him navigate this delicate exchange. The boy I had once known, full of youthful certainty, now demonstrated a depth of emotional intelligence that had grown through confrontation and reflection. He listened with attention, responded with care, and maintained integrity without resorting to defensiveness. And she, though steadfast in her boundaries, revealed patience, openness, and a capacity for reconciliation that spoke volumes about her character. By early evening, the document lay completed on the table, both parties having signed and initialed each page. The room was still, not with tension, but with quiet satisfaction. I could sense the weight lifted, the silent acknowledgement that difficult conversations had been endured and survived. They had not only negotiated terms but had also built a framework for future dialogue, a precedent for honesty, compromise, and shared responsibility. In the aftermath, I reflected on the nature of conflict and resolution. So often, disputes escalate not because of the issues themselves but because of fear, pride, or miscommunication. Witnessing these two navigate the terrain reminded me that confrontation, when approached with patience and authenticity, can strengthen rather than fracture relationships. It also reinforced a personal truth, that even in moments of perceived betrayal, there lies an opportunity for growth, empathy, and renewed connection. As the evening drew to a close, they exchanged a few quiet words, smiles tentative but genuine. I felt a sense of closure, tempered with realism. This was not the end of challenges, only the conclusion of one chapter. The lessons learned here would reverberate beyond the signed pages, shaping how they approached conflict, trust, and partnership in the years to come. And I, as an observer and participant in this journey, carried forward my own reflections on the delicate balance between protection and openness, guidance and independence. I stepped away from the table, leaving them in the shared silence of accomplishment. The prenup, once a symbol of potential division, now represented understanding and emotional labor translated into tangible form. I realized then that true resolution requires more than agreement on paper. It demands engagement, patience, and the willingness to meet another human being fully, even when it challenges our assumptions and comfort. That night, as I closed the door behind me, I felt a deep sense of relief and hope. They had faced the challenge together, not as adversaries, but as partners in a difficult, essential negotiation. And in that shared effort, they had discovered the first glimmers of trust, understanding, and commitment, an outcome far richer than any legal safeguard. I never expected that a moment meant to celebrate love would turn into a lesson I would carry for life. Standing there, watching my son wrestle with choices that seemed so sudden, I realized that dignity isn't given. It's something you preserve quietly, even when the world tries to strip it away. The betrayal stung, yes, but it also opened a door I hadn't seen before. The chance to guide, to reflect, and to ensure that respect and honesty remain at the center of every family bond. Even in moments where voices are silenced, the truth finds a way to echo. And sometimes, it's the smallest gesture, the quietest intervention, that leaves the loudest mark on hearts. If you think this was intense, imagine the moment when someone tried to silence a revelation that couldn't stay hidden. There's another story where hidden truths broke through in the most shocking way, and it will change the way you think about loyalty and confrontation in families. Don't miss how what seemed like control shifted into a moment of undeniable truth that everyone in the room will remember.